Welcome back, researchers. Today we put the final nail in the coffin of the Lequios debate regarding Ryukyu even being an option, thanks to the impeccable geography of Juan González de Mendoza, a Catholic bishop. If you've been following the breadcrumbs from Barbosa to Pigafetta, hold tight, because Mendoza confirms it all. Lequios is Luzon. Bishop Mendoza confirmed it all. Before Jesuit manipulation, settled in 1585, changed in 1615, ignored in academia since, but no longer. Quick refresher from previous videos. Barbosa said that Lequios was 175 leagues east of Malacca, according to a Spanish edition. Now, that should not be a surprise that we end up in Luzon, not Ryukyu, which is far, far away from that. And then we're going to get to this in a full video, but we already covered Pinto's letter to the Jesuits, where he said that Lequios was 250 leagues from China, Fujian, basically. And again, that lands you squarely in Luzon. And in that case, Ryukyu is far too close. Every distance, every credible early map, every early credible source keeps pointing here. Even together, these two references set Luzon Island as a midpoint, practically between Malaysia, Indonesia, and China, a criteria never fitting Ryukyu, and very obvious. It is hard to believe that goes unnoticed in academia. Even PhDs we've been meeting with are not even aware of most of this data right there in the academic record, especially by those who espouse the fiction of that midpoint being Ryukyu, as if Ryukyu is on the way to China. Now that is a joke. It's like saying the North Pole is on the way to the U.S. from Mexico. Proposing a shipwreck there on the way, perhaps, though Pinto landed in Batanes, we will prove, but one is not applying logic to follow Jesuit propaganda over the settled record. They grab a hold of later Jesuit manipulation as the origin, forgetting an entire record already sealed existed in the archives of Spain to this day, and it's really not even up for debate. The reason? They do not want us to know the truth clearly. I'm not talking about the average PhD and historian. I'm talking about those who set this narrative in the first place, and they included criteria where you have to follow their formula, which means to completely ignore the Spanish record, completely ignore the early Portuguese record, and start as an origin point. They do this in history often at the wrong place, a century basically later. That is propaganda. However, this is not mysterious, once again, as Juan González de Mendoza nailed this down the best. Even Wikipedia tells us González de Mendoza's Historia was mostly superseded in 1615 by the work of, get this language, much more informed Jesuit missionaries. Or, in other words, the Jesuits changed history and ignore the previous record. That's not academic, folks. You try to submit something to an academic journal, and they will demand that you address the other positions out there. This one never does. It is silence on the issue. You're talking about maps. You're talking about written history that are recorded and filed, stamped and sealed in the Spanish record. Maps as in Mendoza's early Lequios was located, charted, sealed, authenticated, and cataloged officially. Oops. How exactly is it called much more informed when on this topic they forgot? That's not more informed. That's less informed. Hello? They forgot the entire Spanish government record and even early Portuguese accounts such as Gaval. That should be a well-known account, and hardly anyone knows it. It's called colonial bias and propaganda. Where is their explanation in the Ryukyu Theory of this earlier record? It does not exist. Oops. See? They just ignore it. No longer. Now, he was not a Jesuit, but an Augustine friar and Spanish bishop. Yeah, you're talking credible here. He was also an explorer, sinologist, and writer. What a bishop historian wrote this? Yep. And we'll also go to an archbishop in time who will also record amazing truths affirming this in time. Of course, he will not be a Jesuit either. He was called the Chronicler of China, or really the Orient, publishing around 1585 in one of the first Western accounts with such detail. It does not get more credible, and this is a primary source from academia that must be addressed in any alternative theory to this official record prior. Again, they sweep it under the carpet, they forget about it completely, and go on with a new theory, a strange theory, that Ryukyu was ever the significant land of gold when it has none of the criteria associated with it. That's why many today look at this record, as well as Zipangu being Japan, and they question it as fiction. The reason? Because Ryukyu and Japan do not fit the record. Then they fail to even bother to go to the tropics below the Tropic of Cancer, where all of the resources exist in mass abundance, and so does the historic record and maps. That is not academic, and no one seems to be doing this research in academia today, and that is sad. And that's why we're going around and meeting with them and telling them about it. This is at the beginning of the Jesuit influence, and he clearly did not play along on this topic, which is why it is said the more informed Jesuit history must, of course, outrule his, which they don't even address, they just ignore. And, of course, an entire government record of the Spanish prior. No, thank you. That's colonial bias, propaganda, and outright racism, really. Let's call it what it is, folks. It's time to call colonial bias out as what it is, no matter where it comes from. In his book, he defines the route to China as an expert. Anyone thinking Ryukyu is on the way to China, well, they're not practicing cartography. They're not practicing academic scholarship, nor even basic logic a layman could apply. The reason? They are steeped in the most racist of propaganda streams of colonialism, whether they realize it or not. And look, folks, most do not. They are deceived. In this age, a spotlight will be placed on this mindset, exposing it, and many academics will likely buck the system. We're not finding anyone so far, not a single one, who is pushed back to that degree. They have been willing to listen, and they are enthralled with the information that is just plain not being taught in academia today. But it should be, and they agree. Mendoza writes, now let's go to the actual page in the English translation, of course, because no, we're not reading it in Spanish. We did, we had it translated, but we have a good English translation right here. That is amazing. Between the west and the south is the Taprobana, or Sumatra. Yes, as we have uncovered many times in history, even Pigafetta and many others said Taprobane, or Taprobana, was Sumatra, not Sri Lanka. Now, it is both, because in some references it still is Sri Lanka, and that dynamic is not understood by many cartographers even, who just don't bother. Pomponius Mela defined that in the 1st century. Even the fact that there are 2 Taprobanes that were being confused, and you need to figure out, before you try to map it, before you try to recreate the map, which Taprobane is being used in that reference. They don't do so most, and I mean most, of the time. We have looked at so many maps. Let's continue. A kingdom very rich of gold. That's not Ryukyu. Hello. That's a very simple one. Wouldn't you think the land of gold would have to be a land of gold? That's why many think the Ryukyu Theory is fiction. But they don't bother to go and find that the land of gold is just south of there and fits every single thing about the account. Oh, here we go. Gold. What else? Precious stones and pearls. You mean like Genesis 2, gold, pearl, and the onyx stone? Wow! How about that? That fits Havila, Philippines. Watch Solomon's Gold series. We nail that down, even in etymology, etc. And more towards the south are the 2 Javas, Java Major, Java Minor, the Great and the Less. So that's Java Island and Borneo. And the kingdom of the Lequios, in Spanish as the Portuguese QU, becomes CH often. You'll see that. We've covered that in other videos. We certainly have covered it in our blogs. And in equal distance, oh, that's a key. Did you hear that? In equal distance. All right, so we have an equidistant point, midpoint, being set up in this journey are the Japones, Japan. Now, yes, even the later Jesuits inserted a margin note in this page that Lequios was Ryukyu. That's called illiterate fraud, because he just told you that Lequios is the midpoint, equidistant, which means equal distance between Java and Japan. Oops. Now, we'll go through the math. We'll map this out. That is ludicrous to put Ryukyu in that margin note. It's utter fraud. There's no other way to look at it. Stop right there. That's not poetic. That, my friends, is geographic. We can simply map this out even today and know exactly what he's saying. This is a guy who took the journey to China, who knew that the equidistant midpoint was the Philippines. This is not difficult, or at least it should not be for a cartographer. Yet, we have seen so much. And again, even the margin note in this English translation of Mendoza commits that fraud, that error. Now, look at this map. You can see that Lequios being equidistant, meaning the very midpoint, the exact, basically, midpoint. All right, it can be close. It doesn't have to be to the kilometer, though this one is, from Java to Lequios is equal to the distance from Lequios then, going further, to Japan. These must be equal or very, very close, right? But see, here's the problem. This is Luzon, period. There's nothing to discuss. The equidistant midpoint, 2,500 kilometers from Java to Luzon, to the middle of Luzon. All right, you want to make it 25-25? That's fine. We can do that. Or 25-50, we can do that too. It's still Luzon. But look at this. From Luzon being Lequios, the midpoint, and there is no other qualifier here. That's it. There's no other land. Then to Japan is 2,550 kilometers. That is an exact equidistant midpoint, exactly as the bishop is describing here. Did he not know what he was doing? He took the journey, folks. Jesuits can't go back and correct the journey that he took. He either took the journey or he didn't. Was he mistaken? Are you kidding? He's following actual maps, actual information based on his trip. He's also following the earlier cartography of his time, which did not ever see Ryukyu as Lequios. That's fiction. It's a later record, not the earlier one, not the origin, and it fails every single test. That is pathetic. It is amazing that they would even try such propaganda, because this gets worse. Now take a good look at this map. Equal lengths, perfectly balanced. Mendoza wasn't guessing. He was mapping a journey he actually took. Mendoza draws a straight line, Java to Lequios and Lequios to Japan, equal distance, settled, the end. So what does this look like when we take Ryukyu and try to make it the midpoint as the Jesuits do? See, they just don't bother to put it on a map, evidently, because this is ludicrous. Just look at the map. 3,800 kilometers from Java is Ryukyu. And then it's only 640 kilometers to Japan. See, he didn't just say midpoint. He said equidistant, equal distance from Java to Lequios and from Lequios to Japan must be a very close distance. This is a complete joke. He doesn't place Lequios in Ryukyu. That would distort the entire map. This is easy to assess. Luzon is very clearly an exact midpoint here, while Ryukyu was not a position in the slightest. Every credible early source confirms Luzon as Lequios. Mendoza, equidistant, equal distance from Java and from Japan. Mafra, as Magellan's destination, he did not aim for Ryukyu, but for the Philippines as Lequios, his ultimate destination, in writing, in Mafra's record, and even Magellan's words for that matter. Portuguese Governor Antonio Gavao, 15 to 16 degrees north, and bordering southern Luzon as North Luzon. Really easy, exact geography of the location of the rich white people in the Philippines, known as the Lequios, even in Gavao's later record. So that is not a question. Famous, credible map makers, and we could go through dozens before the Jesuit influence in propaganda, such as Cabin, Santa Cruz, official Spanish royal cartographer, Ribeiro, official Spanish royal cartographer, Rodriguez, Spanish explorer, etc. These are mapped positions in the Philippines every single time. I mean, that alone settles this, but we are not done. as the evidence just on this term Lequios is vast. Anyone espousing the Ryukyu Theory must deal with this, and go read them. They ignore it, as if the record was never there. But it was, blindly following the Jesuits as fact when they never represented anything but fraud on this topic. They changed the record. Who cares why? Likely because they wanted their missions to Japan to be funded by the Spanish and Portuguese governments, yet that's not a valid reason. Indeed, even trying to shrink the China Sea to make their illiteracy work. This includes some of the biggest names in the era of exploration, such as Barbosa's 175 leagues to Luzon as Lequios. And how about Magellan? Yes, Lequios equals Luzon equals Ophir and Tarshish as his destination. And in fact, he even set his destination, according to Antonio Pigafetta, at 12 degrees north of the equator, right in the center of the Philippines. Ryukyu's at 25. Hello, that ain't close. That's also where he landed, so there was no mistake there. And of course, Pigafetta, he says the Lequios were northwest of Cebu. Ryukyu is northeast of Cebu. Hello, that should be pretty easy for those who can read, of course. And even Pinto, 250 leagues to Luzon, with a massive list of resources that all fit the Philippines. Hardly any fit Ryukyu at all. Duh. Yes, the portions that were not manipulated by the leader Jesuits, that is, which we will discuss in a separate video, of course, and that is coming very soon. We have some other things to get out of the way first. In fact, even Marco Polo used this same kind of, and maybe the origin of it in a sense, midpoint logic regarding Kublai Khan's Zipangu. He placed Zipangu, what scholars thought was Japan, erroneously. That's illiterate. We prove that. Watch our 2 videos on Zipangu in Garden of Eden Reveal. Equidistant from China and the South Asian ports, such as South Vietnam. Oops, that's not Japan. Hello. He provided geography in his story, and yet it is completely ignored by most of academia. This includes a list of tropical resources, not found in Japan, like white pepper. That's tropical and grows natively in the Philippines, even recorded by Antonio Pigafetta when the Spanish came. It's not a mystery. Result: this midpoint, about 1,500 nautical miles, wasn't random. It is the Philippines. 1,500 nautical miles from the South China ports, and then another 1,500 miles from Luzon down to South Vietnam. That's easy, and a cartographer should know better. An historian should know better. This is easy. That's not Japan. Over 3,000 nautical miles from South Vietnam. There's 2 criteria there in the story, and they ignore the second one. Yes, it could fit the first one, but the second one, it's nowhere close. It's double the distance. One cannot read Polo's original account and justify such flawed reason. This is logical, solidified by 600 years of maps showing Zipangu as Luzon, such as the famous 1492 Behind Globe we've covered in great detail. Also used by Columbus and Magellan. This was no mystery. Academics are deceived because they do not check the primary sources on this. We do. Bloggers play illiterate as they follow that same ignorance, but the basis, the foundation, is in fact ignoring the actual record. That's not a position. We will demonstrate what was changed and how it is overcome by the rest of entire accounts which geography conflicts if that plot point was actually even there, such as in Pinto's case, where the Jesuits and the translators actually admit they changed the account before it was published. Now, that isn't real hard to find because it's right there in the introductions of Rebecca Katz and others, and that's what they say. So it shouldn't be a mystery that that is not a exact record, especially when compared to everything. So you test the account, as we will, and you'll see for yourself. We'll show you references from even translators detailing that Pinto's journal was in fact changed before publishing, decades after he passed even. Academic consensus among primary early sources is overwhelming. Finally, this was academically identified in history, then verified, then charted in maps and written directions, then sealed by the Spanish government especially. And yes, even Portuguese, such as Gavao, Portuguese governor of Indonesia, with exact coordinates and other references affirming such. And finally, it was placed in the government of Spain's archives in Seville, and, well, it's still there. So why is this not known now? So where is the debate? The Ryukyu Theory for Lequios relies on later fraud accounts, which change history and maps already affirmed and final. It was propaganda, and it is time to obliterate this nonsense once and for all. This series has already done that, and by the end, anyone following the full position, as well as any PhD willing to sit down and discuss this with us, which we welcome, they will know. We have already met with some and have yet to have any serious objections to these primary sources and the conclusions one must logically draw. These are smart people who, when presented with the facts, will listen and deduce with accuracy. That's what we found. Treating Ryukyu far too small, far too north and east, a tiny insignificant group of islands in terms of resources, failing the resources of Zipangu and Lequios, especially the most important, like gold, white pepper, giant ships, 5 very large islands when it does not even have one large island, whether alone very large. So, there it is. Mendoza doesn't just support the Lequios-Luzon identification, he locks it in. The midpoint from Java to Japan is Luzon. Not tricky, folks. Not Japan. Not Ryukyu. End of debate. Lequios is Luzon. Backed by Mendoza, the maps and the math. Like, subscribe, and tap that bell if you're ready for more forgotten history that finally makes sense. Be sure to sign up on our website, thegodculture.org, because YouTube fails to notify usually. And read our blogs now published at thegodculturephilippines.com. Thanks for watching. Ya bless to everyone.